My name is Sharon Cusimano. I'm coming to you from Las Vegas, Nevada, USA, and I'm here to talk to you about my grandfather, Ronald Daniel Spillane, who was a leading aircraftman with the Royal Air Force during World War II. He was based in Detling, Kent, before he left the country, and he went to be stationed at Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong once he was deployed. He was captured on December 25th, 1941.
So what did your grandfather do before joining the military?
He was a negative cutter with Associated British Pathy in London, and he was also a volunteer with the Auxiliary Fire Service in his town.
Where was your grandfather mostly based?
Mostly based in Detling, Kent, and then he was based in Hong Kong at Kai Tak Airfield.
What did your grandfather do in the war?
He was in the motor pool, and at one point during his career, he was commandeered to drive an ambulance, which proved to be very traumatic for him. Tremendous amounts of blood, dreadful injuries, pain and suffering. It really had an effect on him.
And how long was he imprisoned, and where was he imprisoned?
He was imprisoned in Sham Shui Po camp in Hong Kong, and he was there for almost 4 years.
Did he happen to keep a journal or send letters home?
He sent letters home, but didn't keep a journal. It was very dangerous for them to keep journals in those days. It wasn't until he was going to be sent to Japan for the 1964 Olympics that he was inspired to record his experiences in the war. It took a long time for him to come to terms with it, and that was the genesis of what we have now as a manuscript.
What do you feel is the most interesting, unusual, or brave part of your grandfather's story?
His resilience was remarkable. He suffered from dysentery, beriberi. He lost his sight temporarily. All the while, during that time, he had a book by the name of 3 Men in a Boat read to him. It was written by Jerome K. Jerome, and it actually made him laugh. He was able to laugh in the face of all this tragedy and trial. And they even put a pantomime on together, all the troops that were imprisoned. But his resilience and strength are what really struck me.
Have you been able to visit where your grandfather was in the Far East?
I would dearly love to visit Hong Kong. Apparently there is a plaque where Sham Shui Po camp once stood, and I would like to visit there one day.
Was he awarded any war medals or awards?
We don't know. I'm in the process of trying to track those down. There's a process you go through. It's a little bit complicated, but I really would like to obtain the medals that he earned.
What is your fondest memory of your grandfather?
My grandfather, Gampa, was very kind to me. He was my father figure during my formative years, and he used to help me with my homework, mostly my maths. Nana used to help me with my English and spelling, but Gampa was always with the math. And I remember him getting me up in the mornings to go to school. He'd have my warm milk and halib orange ready for me, and my shoes were polished along with his. And I remember slipping my hand into what seemed to be an enormous hand of his. It always made me feel very secure.
Mm-hmm. How did he celebrate when he returned home from the war?
I don't know that there was much of a celebration, to be honest with you. We don't have a record of a celebration. I know that the reunion with my mother and grandmother was somewhat stilted at the train station when he arrived home. He had lost so very much weight that my grandmother didn't even recognize him on the platform. And he swept my mother up into his arms She was 5 years old at the time, but he coddled her like a baby, like she was when he left at the age of 6 months old. So it was bittersweet.
How do you feel his attitude towards the war was once he returned home?
The men who served were told not to discuss their experiences in the war with family members because it might have been too traumatic for them. He never spoke of it around me. I don't know if he spoke to his male relatives who had also served, but there wasn't much in the way of discussion.
What did he do after the war?
He worked for the BBC, and he was with the Sports View crew. As I mentioned earlier, he went to Tokyo for the 1964 Olympics to set up for the crew to arrive. He was always involved in film and production in some respect.
Are you currently involved in any veteran or family of veterans charities or organizations?
Yes, I'm a member of COFIPO, Children of Far East Prisoners of War in England, the UK rather. I'm also the welfare officer for the Catholic War Veterans Auxiliary here in Las Vegas, and I volunteer at the VA hospital in the emergency room.
And how will you be celebrating the 75th anniversary of VJ Day this year?
My mother and I had intended to come to England for the celebration at Lichfield Cathedral this August. Unfortunately, with COVID-19 looming its head, we've had to postpone those plans until VJ+1 next year. So we'll have a quiet commemoration of our own.
What was your father's full rank and what part of the armed service was he in?
My father's full rank was Colour Sergeant in the Royal Norfolk Regiment in the Army.
Where was your father mostly based?
He was based in Great Yarmouth, and then he was sent to India where he served 6.5 years, and then he was recalled to the 4th Battalion, where sent down to the Far East where he was captured on the 15th of the 2nd, 1942.
And where was your father imprisoned and for how long?
My father was incarcerated in Thailand for 3.5 years, where he worked on the infamous Thai-Burma Railway.
And what is the most interesting, unusual or brave part of your father's war story?
Surviving the atrocities of the Japanese for 3.5 years.
How did your father celebrate when he returned home?
Sadly, when my father's war ended in the Far East, there was no celebrations when he returned.
What did your father do after the war?
My father became employed in the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall in London and became an EO, an executive officer.
First of all, father was Leslie Frederick Long, and he was born in Oxford on the 2nd of May 1919. Before joining the military, he worked as a college servant at Christ Church College in Oxford. He started in the Royal Signals with the rank of signalman, and during his career, you might say, in the Royal Signals, he rose to corporal. They sailed on a vessel called the Empress of Japan, very aptly named. It was the largest convoy ever at that time to set sail from Britain. It had 21 ships plus escort. And the journey was very roundabout. Les detailed it in his notes. They went across, first of all, and came down the east coast of the States, and then crossed over to Sierra Leone, down to Cape Town, and I won't go on to all the individual places they stopped. In Cape Town, they were made very welcome, I must admit, and they were allowed shore leave. They arrived in Singapore on the 11th of March, 1941. So it had taken from the 7th of January to the 11th of March, more or less 2 months to get to Singapore, Changi prison, and he remained there till 25th of April, 1943. And at that stage, he was transported by hell ship, as they're called, the Kyoko Maru to Japan. The journeys on the hill ships were very, very, I don't know if you've ever read about them, but they are, there is a book, Death on the Hill Ships. Can't remember the author's name straight off, which I have there. But a lot of them were sunk because the Japanese didn't mark them as prisoners of war ships being carried. And the British actually did sink some of them themselves, not knowing. The journey took, I can't remember how long they said now. They arrived, he was in army camp from May the 22nd, he got there anyway. And the camp was the site of Denki Kagaku. There are three different types of camp. There were a base camp, a detached camp, and a dispatched camp. And in the third later dispatched camp, the owners of the site, Omi was a quarry, they were producing fertilizers and such, that were the owners, so they were responsible for billeting, feeding, and clothing the prisoners, and the Japanese army were responsible for security. It didn't quite work that way, but that was the theory of them. 2016 put up a large memorial in the factory, in the grounds of the factory, to honour the 65 British prisoners that died in the camp. They all showed strength of character and sort of the will to survive. But I mentioned that Stephen Abbott was the commanding officer of the camp, but by three weeks over John Paul Burrough. And John Paul Burrough was in the signals, he was a lieutenant, and his father was the vicar of St Michael and All Angels in Summertown, Oxford, for 35 years, right through the war period. And he was very popular. He carried the radio. He split the radio up, and every man in the signal group of them going to Japan had a piece of the radio which could be built back later. And he kept them, basically, with picking up the information up to date on what was going on. Now he, Les always said, and it's in his notebook, he said, if it hadn't been for John Paul Burrough, he would never have survived the war. The Defence Medal and the War Medal, which I think were quite normal for most people in the war. He also had the 3945 Star and also the Pacific Star.
Hello, my name's Laila, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about my grandfather, who was a FIPO. My grandfather, Patrick Nolan, was born and raised in County Wexford, Southern Ireland. He came from a very large family, but lived in a very small village. So at the age of 22 in 1935, he decided to go to England to join the British Army. He went and joined the Royal Artillery. After his training, he was posted to Gibraltar from 1936 to 1939. He enjoyed his posting there, and one of his duties there was looking after the Barbary apes that live on the rock. In 1939, he was posted over to Singapore. In February of 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese. He was imprisoned in the notorious Changi jail. In October of 1942, he and another 599 men were transferred by hell ship over to Rabaul in the Solomon Islands. They suffered ill treatment, malnourishment, disease. Many of his comrades died. The groups were split, and at the end of the war, on Liberation Day, of the 600 men that were taken, only 18 survived, my grandfather being one of them. This is one of the most impressive parts of his war history. He was repatriated to England in December of 1945. He returned to his native island, where his family received a great big shock because they had assumed he had been killed in action. January of 1946, he was married, and when he returned to England to continue his army career with his wife. They spent time in southern England at various different bases, had 3 daughters, And then in 1958, the whole family was drafted out to Hong Kong for a 2-year posting. They returned to Europe, to Holland and Germany, and then finally back to England in 1967 when he retired from the army after 32 years and 70 days of very happy service. He received several medals, the 1939-45 Star, the Pacific Star, the War Medal, the Defence Medal, and the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal. My grandfather is stated to have said that he bore no animosity to the Japanese people, and that the Japanese soldiers behaved in the way that they did due to the kind of training that they had received. He left the army with the rank of Staff Sergeant. Sadly, his wife passed away, and after a couple of years he decided to go to live at the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. Became one of the Chelsea pensioners, which he thoroughly enjoyed, living with the other soldiers with like-minded experiences, etc. One of my fondest memories was going to visit my grandfather and having dinner with lunch and dinner with the old soldiers, and hearing stories and seeing him dressed up in a scarlet uniform looking very smart. This year for VJ Day, me and my family will be celebrating with a small garden party. We will raise a toast to the fallen, to the ones who endured and the ones who made it home. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
My father, George Porter, was a bombardier in the Royal Artillery and a Far East prisoner of war for 3.5 years. He had been a hotelier before the war, and he joined the 135th Royal Artillery, the Hertfordshire Yeomanries, under the command of Colonel Toosey. They were based in the UK initially, and in October 1941 they travelled from Gurrook on to Halifax, and then on the Mount Vernon round the African coast, arriving in Singapore in January 1942. They fought on the mainland in Malaya and then on Singapore Island in trying to defend during the Battle of Singapore. 15th of February, the Allies capitulated, and 2 days later, my father's regiment with Colonel Toosey marched to Changi. They were in Changi for a few months and then moved down to Bukit Timah on the island of Singapore to build a shrine for the Japanese. In October 42, they were told that they would be moving to another camp where there would be better food and better conditions. As it happened, they were transported on railway wagons for 4 days and 4 nights, and arrived in the jungle in thick mud, and then learnt that they were to build a railway. That railway was the famous Bangkok-Burma Railway, or Death Railway as it is now known. My father was based at Tamakan Camp, which was the base camp for building the bridges across the Kwai Noi, which is now known as the River Kwai. He remained there when the rest of the regiment went up the jungle to continue work on the railway, as my father was running the canteens at Tamakan, and Tamakan was then converted into a hospital camp. During that time, Colonel Toosey had negotiated with a local Thai businessman, Boon Pong, to obtain and smuggle into the camp medication and money from Bangkok, from the expatriates in Bangkok. This was a very risky business, and I know that my father was involved in bringing these items into the camp. It was dangerous work. He also, I know from what he told us when we were children, that they used to steal eggs and bananas and other food that was specifically for the Japanese, for the very sick prisoners. After Tamakan, he was moved to Nong Pladuk, and he was there for quite a while. That was at the southern end of the railway, and I think it was a sort of a marshalling yard where they repaired the railway after the railway had been completed. After that, in the October, I think, of 1944, he and most of his regiment were moved from Nong Pladuk up to Bangkok. They spent a week there and then moved to Ubon province in the northeast of Thailand to build an airstrip for the Japanese. And that's where he was when the Japanese surrendered on the 15th of August 1945. He didn't keep a diary as such, but I did find amongst his possessions a little journal, a notebook that he obviously acquired at his time in Tamarkan. And the journal contains a lot of lists of names and addresses, lists of books, lists of recipes, lists of favourite roses, lists of English sporting achievements, FA Cup wins, Grand National winners, and also the important dates of everything that happened to him during his time. So he recorded when the mail came or hadn't come, when the rest of his regiment went up the jungle, when the prisoners were being sent off to Japan. So that was very helpful for me in my research, and along with a trip to Thailand inspired me to do some paintings to tell his story. After the war, he returned home on a hospital ship. He always told us that he only weighed 6 stone and was very malnourished. He'd suffered from many diseases, beriberi, malaria, not cholera, but countless other diseases. He'd been stung by a scorpion, and he wasn't a well man. I also know that after his return, he, having been a very gregarious man, having been a bon vivant who was in the hospitality industry, he was unable to go into a shop or a pub or a restaurant on his own. He just couldn't do it. However, he, as did everyone, got back into normal life. He got a job working for the Kuwait Oil Company, in charge of the catering provisioning of a sort of a new industry out in the Middle East, and that's where he met my mother and had his 2 daughters. I think he led quite a happy life, but he had a lot of illness. He did have nightmares. He had a lot of neurological problems, and he died in 1979. And yes, I have wonderful memories of him. I remember his stories and his sense of humour, which is what he said always got him through his time as a POW. He was never scared, or he was never reluctant to talk about it. But clearly he did disguise some of the more dreadful things that happened. Everything was masked in an amusing story. So I have very fond memories of him. And this VJ Day, we shall be remembering him. We shall be remembering all the POWs and everyone who was involved in the Pacific War. But it's also my husband's birthday, so we shall be celebrating as well.
My father is Gunner Donovan Clark of the 135th Field Regiment Royal Artillery. He was a quad driver for a 25-pounder gun. Dad's regiment was sent in a convoy destined for the Far East, but due to the problems that were happening in Singapore, their ship was diverted into Singapore to help with the situation there. Unfortunately, this was a little bit too late because Dad's gun was only in action for 15 days before he was taken prisoner. Dad was a prisoner in Singapore and Thailand for 3.5 years. He worked on the bridge over the Kwai for 6 months, and after that he was working along various camps on Death Railway. He got as far as Halfar Pass and Hal Corner before he was too ill to work. At that point, a decision was made of what happened to him, and luckily he was put on a barge which took him downstream and back to a camp called Chiang Kai. From Chiang Kai, after recovery, he was sent to various holding camps and so-called hospitals. From there he went to northeast Thailand, where he was in a camp by the name of Ubon, and it was there that the war ended and freedom came. As the Japanese advanced, a group of gunners in Dad's battery were captured. An ultimatum was given by the Japanese that if we did not immediately surrender, these guys would be killed. There was no surrender, and unfortunately the Japs tied these guys' hands and they bayoneted them all in the back. There was one survivor who was looked after afterwards by a Chinese family, and he managed to get back to his regiment when they were in Changi. I know this to be true because this guy was a friend of Dad's and he slept next to him, and Dad looked after the deep wounds in his back. The prisoners took many and regular beatings, even at night. One night Dad was on his way to the latrines when he tripped over a pile of bamboo. The next thing he knew, he was being kicked and beaten by a Korean guard, nicknamed the Undertaker. Dad feared for his life as he kept on, and he thought he wasn't going to stop. But Dad was left in a situation that he was even unable to eat his rice for many days afterwards. The war was not discussed in the family home, and looking back, I now believe that my mother was protecting Dad from the horrors that he had experienced. Dad's attitude to the Japanese is quite interesting now, because he clearly said at the end of his life that he would forgive the Japanese for what they did to him, but he would never ever forgive them for what they did to his friends.